We both started in the House together, Jim 2 years after I did, and I think we both rely on each other to try to sort through these complicated questions. That's why we're glad to do this together. Turn you over to Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And let me just add a little bit to what Chris has said and fill in some of the color. And then, of course, the point here is to hear from you and how you're thinking about this. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I've been watching the situation very closely, particularly in Syria, as that boiled over a year ago, or a little more than a year ago, and now watching pretty closely what's happening in Iraq. And I will tell you that it is unbelievably complex, as Chris said. Not only is it Shia versus Sunni, you've got Alawites here and different versions of Shiite here, you've got tribal issues, you have different sort of extremists. Sometimes we say Muslim extremists, but you've got to be sure you know what it is you're talking about. The Taliban is different than Al-Qaeda, is different than ISIS. They have different objectives, different ambitions, very complicated. The overlay, as Chris said, is also artificial. And I raise that point because sometimes it seems to me in Washington that the apparatus says we need to stand up for the integrity of the Iraqi state. You'll notice that these lines are largely straight. These lines are straight because, as Madeleine Albright so wonderfully puts it, these borders were drawn by British and French diplomats lying to each other in ministries in Paris and in London after World War II. So when we say we need to stand up,
World War I.
I meant one. Sorry, World War I. When we say that we should stand up for the integrity of the Iraqi state, we better ask ourselves the questions about whether the Iraqis believe still in an Iraqi state, because as the previous map showed you, you actually have at least 3 different groups of people who, partly naturally, but also because the sectarian violence has been so intense, are at a point when it's not clear that they want to live together. Now let me just, in the interest of being very short, I think I share most of Chris's point of view on this. I've been struggling for an organizing principle, how to think about the mess. I just intuitively feel like, as Chris said, it's a bit odd in Iraq to be supporting a bad, and I'll just use the phrase, a bad Iranian client leader against a Sunni insurgency when we're doing exactly the opposite, supporting a Sunni insurgency against a bad Iranian client Shiite leader in Syria. That's not a comfortable position to be in. So I would just tell you, we're here to listen. I think both Chris and I will listen to the President when he makes a proposal. We will certainly listen to the experts and most importantly listen to you. But the organizing principles that I'm carrying around for thinking about this are what Chris referred to as our fundamental interests. And my premise is, subject to, I'm a representative, so subject to your thoughts, my premise is that we have 2 very clear interests in the region to help us think through how we ought to answer specific questions. One is, and this is, by the way, a tough thing to say to people like the Saudis. If you are, let's not use the word democracy, it's going to be a long time before these states are democratic. If you have a more open rather than less form of government that is responsive to people in one form or another, if you treat women reasonably well, if you treat your minorities, whether they are Alawites or Sunnis or whatever they may be, if you treat them relatively well, if you abide by international conventions and norms, if you abide by agreements that have been signed, if it's Palestinian Israel, if you are that group of people, we will be your friend. If you are not, we won't. And by the way, not being your friend doesn't mean we're sending troops or anything else, but we will align ourselves with people who share our fundamental values. And again, that's not an easy thing to say, because there are allies for whom that is not true. Point number 2 is, and I think this gets to where and when should we specifically intervene. I couldn't agree more with the Senator that we need to avoid at all costs joining somebody's team. And I have this nervousness that advisors going in to help Maliki is coaching one of the 3 teams there. Where I think our interest lies and our commitment lies is that as Iraq and Syria, whatever they may be, and there are a lot of countries, and by the way, it's Somalia and it's Libya and it's Egypt and it is Morocco and it is, it is certainly Afghanistan. As these countries figure out what form they're going to take, an exercise that must be led by them, we will do all that we can through the United Nations, through NATO, through whatever we need to do to see that that happens as peacefully as it can happen. However, if anybody, whether the Taliban in Afghanistan or the Sunnis in this area here or the radicals in Syria, if they nurture, sponsor, protect, or support terrorists who have ambitions to go after us, to go after Israel, to go after Europe, to go after Russia, if that's who you are, as my friends in the intelligence community say, we will find, fix, and finish you. And we are doing this all over the world today in a way that is comfortable in some ways and not comfortable in others. Remember, we are struggling against terrorism in Yemen, in Nigeria, in parts of Kenya, in Somalia, in Egypt. The list of countries goes on. And we are actually relatively good at identifying the truly bad transnational terrorist actors, and in ways that make some people uncomfortable sometimes, and not at other times, we go after them pretty effectively. I think that's where our interests lie, in going after those people, and only those people who have transnational terrorist interests. And again, as Chris said, we have to be very, very careful about aligning ourselves with one of the sects or one of the sides in the multifaceted civil war that we unfortunately see playing out in all these countries where Chris said we bear some responsibility. When a Mubarak goes away, a Mubarak, a Saddam Hussein, an Assad, through brutal mechanisms, can quash temporarily sectarian fights. When they go away, as we're seeing in Egypt and Syria and Iraq, those fights emerge in a big way. They need to work that out, and we need to be very, very careful about not being perceived as being on one team or the other.
We build this as being a forum on some topics broader than Iraq. This is the current crisis, so we wanted to begin there. But as a framework for questions, we are now only about 2 months away from the deadline on nuclear negotiations with Iran, at a moment in which all of a sudden we find ourselves on similar sides temporarily of a fight inside Iraq. News of the 3 teenagers being found in Israel and a potential new front against Hamas being opened in the West Bank or in Gaza. Clearly we can talk about the ongoing crisis in Syria. The president has now proposed a major new investment of American dollars in training and standing up the vetted elements of the moderate Syrian opposition. Question as to exactly how we would figure out who those people are, but there are a lot of questions in the region, and we'd love to talk about all subjects.